It's hard to believe that we've come down to the last session. Semester's gone by pretty quickly. At least it has for me, or faster than I had anticipated that it would. What we want to do in our last session is to finish up we were looking at kind of the final stage of the final phase of life, dealing with death and dying, and we kind of did somewhat of an introduction into that the last time that we met. We want to finish that up today and then just maybe kind of draw some just very general kind of conclusions and kind of wrap up where we've been for the semester. What we want to do is take a look at next, looking at just kind of a general understanding of how individuals at different stages of life view or understand death and dying. When we think about young children, and again, I don't know if anyone has a reference or kind of a context for that, but thinking back what we know about young children, particularly preschool children, how do they tend to see and understand death? Kind of from your own experiences.
So it's very hard for Sarah to grasp.
For really, really young children, it's really hard to grasp the concept, and particularly to understand really the reality of what death means and what that experience is like. Anyone else, just in terms of, it's part of, again, a way of understanding the thinking of again, young child, or what we really would say pre-concrete child, again, in that pre-operational stage in terms of what they understand. And again, for a 2-year-old has a hard time really grasping or even understanding the reality of that. A 5-year-old tends to, again, going back to what we talked about earlier in the semester, making connections. And so all of a sudden you make a connection from something that you kind of experienced, and then again for that 5-year-old, it's like in a sense, which is partly true, when you get old or older, you die, and it made the connection with a particular age at that point, and then that was the connection that he made. And it wouldn't be surprising for some young children that if they met an older adult, and I guess this is probably maybe bad to say, and somehow their age came out. And they said, well, I'm 80 or 82. What might that 5-year-old mistakenly say based on their experiences? Or are you going to die, or something to that? I mean, may make again that connection again based on that level of understanding. It's usually not until children move from pre-operational, again looking at Piaget's stages that we talked about earlier in the semester, to concrete thinking, do children understand that death is irreversible, universal, and that life functions end. And again, be sure and underline, highlight whatever you need to do to kind of to get that kind of clear in your mind. It is that transition from pre-operational, again, to concrete thinking, where kids really begin to understand the reality of death. And prior to that, they tend to have difficulty. Part of that is that a lot of things that we say to young children are not particularly helpful in terms of their understanding. Can you think of an example of something that someone may say with the best of intentions to a young child, trying to be helpful? And again, here we're talking pre-operational child. What would be something that might be unhelpful in terms of their understanding? Because there's some of the things that often get said related to someone who has passed away. And hopefully we're moving more and more away from these kinds of comments.
I think that they're still around, but they're still with us.
And what are some of the things that we say to give that image?
They're watching over you.
Okay, that they're watching over you. What's something else that we often will say? Sometimes people talk about they've gone on a trip, or maybe even worse in some ways, they're sleeping, and we say that to kind of be comforting. But what's the pre-operational child believe when we use any of those kinds of statements? Huh? Well, that they really are doing that, and that they are or will at some point in time wake up or come back. If they've gone on a trip, then they're going to, and then so they will periodically ask, well, when is so-and-so coming back? Or even the notion of them watching, over us, which to some extent may be a true kind of statement, but one that really young children have a hard time of what that really means, or understanding, the symbolism of that. So again, it's not until that transition that children really begin to understand. And there are a lot of ways that even with young children we can help them begin to start to understand and to make some of the connections. But a lot of it really has to do with again, being very simple, but also being very honest with children. And young children very frequently, have to deal with the death. Maybe not necessarily of a loved one, but who do many young children end up having to deal with in terms of the death? Grandparents, pets in many cases. And so there is a context to help them, kind of understand and deal with that. What about adolescents and young adults? How do they tend to understand or see death, do you think? Don't make it too overly complex.
Scary.
Could be scary.
It seems like a far off thing.
Yeah. It really is. It seems like a far... And so for most young adults and adolescents, it's not something they really think much about. Particularly in terms of, again, of their own. And even in terms of for others, it's just not something that many young people tend to think a lot about. Again, in terms of their own, it's something that's a long ways away. Particularly for the young adolescent, what do they believe? Going back to earlier in the semester? Invincibility. So nothing bad's going to happen to me. It goes back to that sense of uniqueness. So in terms of something happened to me, it's not something I give a whole lot of thought about. But just the topic, the issue at all, is just something that most young people don't think about. Young adults tend to be, they're kind of in the prime of their health, so the notion or the thought of some type of a terminal illness is not something that really crosses their mind. They're really focused on starting careers, beginning families, and so death, again, is not something that tends to be very central to their lives. And again, unless life experiences brings that close to home. As we've already said earlier in the semester, when we were talking about middle-aged adults, it is the time when, at the phase of life when people tend to become introspective, for all the reasons that we talked about earlier, begin to think about death, are probably experiencing people around their age that have passed away. It is the point where they do become more aware of health concerns and health issues, and may actually be dealing with some of those to some extent at that stage. And so death becomes much more of a reality. And it is also the stage of life when we all of a sudden, as we've already talked about in terms of perspective on time, become aware that we may have actually less time to live than what we have already lived. And so that perspective on time begins to shift. Not necessarily an overly concern, but clearly a different awareness. And then when we hit late adulthood, obviously, is the point when the realities, the inevitableness of death is something that we really begin to deal with and address in our own lives. We mentioned the other day, we talked about grief being the initial emotional response to bereavement or the loss of someone. I want to look at just kind of an overview of the stages of grief that people tend to go through. I think it's important to emphasize strongly the variability. There are a lot of factors that determine to the extent to which people experience grief, how long they may stay in any one stage. But I do think that there is a tendency to move through these three stages. And like I said, the length of it, the intensity of it will vary based on the nature of the relationship, the length of the relationship, how close you were to that person, the circumstances around the loss of whether it was something that was more anticipated, whether it was something that was unexpected and sudden, whether it was something that was more traumatic or more tragic. Again, when it tends to be something that happens to an adult that's in their later stages of life, largely due to simply the aging process, doesn't mean that we don't grieve, but the intensity of that may be different than someone who's much younger, and it results in something much more unexpected and much more tragic. So again, a lot of factors that come into play. I don't want anybody to share anything that they're uncomfortable with. And again, I don't know the extent to which anyone in this room, I've shared some of my own experiences in the last couple of years. But anyone who's really been close to someone and felt like you really went through the grieving process, what do you remember about that experience? What were some of your emotional responses, if you can recall any of that at all? Again, the denial is a very common initial emotional reaction to, and particularly in those situations where, again, it's unexpected, where there hasn't been any opportunity to prepare for that. Anyone else? Just in terms of emotional reactions, what you remember feeling, thinking, going through. Were you fairly close to some of those? Yeah, and I've known some others that, again, and again, it's a stage of life where it's not supposed to happen. It's not something you anticipate, expect. And again, it goes back to our adolescent kind of invincibility, almost believing that these things can happen particularly to our age group. And I've known some, some that have had some relationship with who have lost not only one, someone in high school that they were really close to, but a couple in a given year. And that's really difficult when that happens really close together. Again, just dealing with that the imageries of, gosh, just last week or yesterday we were doing whatever it is we were doing, riding in the car or going to the mall, and now they're not here. And again, like you said, just simply that denial, almost that inability to accept that reality, even though part of you knows it, emotionally it's hard initially to accept it.
Well, when they had like open caskets, I'm like, get up, get up.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's really hard.
Anyone else? Particularly if it's occurred prematurely. And to some extent, it's always premature. If we're dealing with someone who's 95 or 97, then it becomes a whole lot easier. But then, when it occurs much before that, I mean, even with my dad, who was 71, I still felt that was premature. That it was way too early, even though it was the stage of late adulthood. And then a lot of times there is anger. How could this happen? Why did it happen? Couldn't it somehow been prevented? And a lot of the anger is that something has been taken away. And it's part of dealing again with that loss, of that loved one, for sure. Most of you have really picked up on the first stage. Again, not any big surprise, is shock and disbelief. Or again, a couple of terms a term that many of you have used is denial, and that really is that first stage. Even though you know it. I mean, in my situation with my dad, I was there. I mean, I was there in the room the night that he passed away, and I was the one who notified the healthcare staff, when it did occur. And so, I mean, there is nothing more real than in a lot of ways that, in some ways, just kind of almost horrifying kind of experience. Yet at the same time, hours later, you still have trouble believing it. Still accepting it that it's occurred, even though that it has. A lot of people talk about overwhelming sadness, feeling lost, feeling confused. Some use the term, which I think was more characteristic of me, numbness. People that I've been close to, and again, it has not been a lot of people in my life. My dad probably would have been the closest, a sense of numbness. I felt like that I was just kind of moving through the motions of life, but wasn't connected to life. I could make myself do the things I had to do, but when I didn't have to do something, I just was like lost in my own world. And I probably do that a lot in stressful situations. And I just felt really numb. I didn't feel as confused as I felt disoriented. And it was really hard to connect to other things that were going on. And I would sit for long periods of time and do nothing. Even though I probably should have been. And it happened in the summer. So I wasn't working. I wasn't going into the office every day. So I had a whole lot more free time. But I went through a long period of time when I just really couldn't focus. I couldn't do a lot of things. And again, for a lot of people, it is that overwhelming sadness, at that loss, and basically become kind of momentarily unable to do much else, unless there are things that you absolutely have to do. And it was interesting that for me, I don't think it even hit when it first occurred. I was helping my mom a lot with making arrangements and dealing with those things, and getting ready for the funeral. And you get so wrapped up in that you don't have a lot of time to think about and then all of a sudden the funeral's over and all that's done. And then for me, that's when a lot of the emotions kind of hit, when you can begin to kind of focus, begin to think about it. How long this stage lasts, that numbness and that denial varies greatly, in terms of how people begin to allow themselves in what they do. If people kind of begin to connect with their support network, We kind of understood some of death and dying, and we knew how important it was to talk about it, and to talk about the relationship and to talk about experiences, with my siblings and with my wife and with others, and even my son to a certain extent. And I really think that helped a lot. Was it hard? Yeah, it was hard. But I did think it helped move from this first stage into the second stage a lot quicker than it may happen. I've known of some who have been in denial for years and never allowed themselves to move to the next stages. Now, they may have begun to re-engage in life in some ways, not realizing that they hadn't dealt with it only until years later. I remember was in a group process class when I was working on my graduate degree in counseling. And I remember there was an older woman, probably middle-aged adult in there, that all of a sudden, as a result of that class, got in touch with the loss of someone early in her life that had never been dealt with, and that she had denied it and kind of buried those emotions. And it wasn't until that process that she actually began to work through the rest of the grieving process. And that would have been, you had mentioned, 15 some years, and for her it probably was 20 plus some years. So again, a lot of variability in terms of what people are able to or what they do with this first stage. Tends to be a relatively short period of time in terms of the denial, the numbness, the overwhelming sense of sadness. And then people often will move to the second stage, which is preoccupation. This may last 6 months, longer. And what this simply is you've kind of moved through the really strong intensity of the emotions, though you may get sad at different times as you're moving through this stage, but it isn't that overwhelming sense of sadness that you experience in that first stage. But what begins to happen is you just think about the person a lot. I mean, in no simple terms. I mean, you think about the person a lot. I know in my own experience, you drive by places that I remember for my son, and it was the loss of his grandfather. There was a particular place where my dad really loved to eat. And so whenever we drove by that place, it made him think about his grandfather and brought back memories. And so it's kind of part of that stage or that phase. And so you begin to think about experiences that you had, things that you've done, particularly if you were really close and you had done a lot of things, fairly recently with that individual. For those that particularly maybe have lost a spouse, the intensity of that can be particularly strong as you relive, those memories, and sometimes those are positive memories. Sometimes they're not as positive, and sometimes in the midst of that, as you're kind of thinking through, you may also be dealing with some of the regrets, some of the things that you wish you may have done, wish you may have said, as you're reflecting on your life with that, with that person. I think to some extent there is a real intensity of that preoccupation that begins to kind of wane. But I think in really close relationships, I'm not sure that stage ever goes completely away. But I don't think there. But what happens, I think, is as you begin to reflect on those experiences, they tend to have more positive reactions than more negative emotional reactions. And as I think about, as the year and a half has gone by, I still think about things we did and positive memories. But it's more of a positive kind of feeling. The satisfaction of having shared life doing those kinds of things, than the sadness that was there early on. It's still that focus on memories, but a different emotional reaction. And I think it's kind of the gift of memories. The fact that you can remember those kinds of things, and it's something that you can hold on to, and you still can keep with you and take with you. And it doesn't have a lot of the more painful emotions associated with it. And I don't think that's strange or unusual. I mean, I think a lot of times people really do feel like, that in a lot of ways the person is still with them, somehow still, giving some sense of direction. I mean, some people actually talk about, in the intensity of that, actually momentarily believing that they actually, they see someone that looks similar and may actually believe that they've seen the person.
There is actually a doctor that works for Cox that he looks just like the grandfather.
Yeah.
And he will come in when I have to call him in the ER, and he'll sit next to me, and I swear, he's just my grandfather sitting next to me when my grandfather was not the doctor.
Yeah. But again, it's part of what's going on in terms of as our minds kind of working and thinking through and dealing with it. And I've heard a lot of people talk about, the sense that, that the person, feels like the person is right there with me or in the same room, and again, people experience this stage, uniquely, very, very, very differently. And a lot of it, again, is related to how close that relationship, was and the experiences that you shared. I think what happens is that, again, the intensity and the painfulness of this stage begins to lessen, and I think we still live with the memories, but what does happen, and again, here talking about relationships that are really, really close, we do come to a point of resolution. And it's not resolution in the sense that we no longer grieve, that there's no longer a sadness, that there's no longer a sense of loss, that we no longer have those memories. Those are all still there. But what does happen is that we're able to begin to move on and to re-engage our life, in our interest, our everyday activities, our work, other relationships, and the other is still there, but it's not playing that primary focus in our life that it did during those earlier stages. Like I said, people will move through these stages at different rates, will stay in different stages for longer periods of time. A lot of it is how people choose to respond and deal with the loss, the sadness, and the memories with that. I think it's important just to mention very quickly just some things in terms of children. I think so often we overlook and we de-emphasize children's experiences of loss and children's experiences. And I think sometimes we fail to realize is that children, like adults, grieve. They experience the loss. And for children, that can be very profound. Now, how they react to it, how they respond to it, what they do with that may be very different than adults, but it's not any less real. And particularly in a context where, and again, a child may have lost, and again, I've known of some even this year who have lost a friend, a playmate, or a grandparent, at some point in time. I think particularly, though, what becomes really difficult is those situations where children lose a parent, because that really is a very profound loss in the child's life. And I think there are some things that are real important that we know how to help respond to that child as they are going through their own grieving process. And so these are just some general kinds of guidelines, because I don't think we ever want to lose sight of the significance of that loss to the child. It's important, one, to help them understand that death is final. Again, even with pre-operational children, even though that level of understanding, the reality of that will be very, very different than older children, we want to begin to help them make those connections. And so it's important that we answer their questions simply, but we're also honest with them. Again, we want to be really careful of talking about that they've gone on a trip, they're sleeping, those kinds of things that would give them the indication or the idea that they're coming back. Because that makes it more difficult for them to really work through that grieving process and begin to really come in terms with the fact that indeed the person is gone, they're not coming back, and so it's important that we help them begin to understand that regardless of the age. And really young children will understand that to a less degree. This one may seem strange, but again, if you think back to when we were talking about young children in terms of how they see, how they understand the world, how they understand events in their lives, that really young children may actually somehow make inaccurate connections between things and somehow believe that it may be their fault and that somehow they're responsible. And it's really important to reassure them that they had absolutely nothing to do with it. It's not their fault. Thirdly, they need reassurance. Can you think of a couple of things that young children might need reassurance of? There are a couple of things. That they're going to be taken care of. Excellent. What else? Because again, the absence of that parent is someone who was responsible for helping meet many of their needs. That person's gone. They need to know that my needs are still going to be taken care of. What's a couple of other things that they may need reassurance of? And again, be that child. That 4, 5, 6-year-old child.
I lost my dad when I was 6, so I was worried, like, my mom was
There.
So I was like attached to her at the hip.
Excellent.
I like if she would go like out for the night, I'd like stay up late for her, make sure she came home, and just could not like leave her at all.
Yeah. One of the things that happens with children, you hit it right on the nail. I mean, they tend to become very possessive, very clingy, and part of it is the ultimate fear for a child who's 4 or 5, in your case 6 years of age, is, I mean, there's the great loss of that parent, but even the worst nightmare would be to lose both parents and then be on my own. And who's going to take care of me? And so there is a tendency to want to hold on and need to be reassured that that other parent is going to be there. And what's the third thing? And this may seem a little bit strange, but it still can be a reality for a young child. And not that we can ever guarantee it, but it can be real important that we try to reassure them that they're okay. You know, because one of the things that can happen for the young child is to, again, make a connection that, you know, that if something happened to one of my parents, it could happen to me. And they could become very, very fearful and very, very frightened, either at the loss of someone else that they're really close to or themselves. And so, again, they clearly need reassurance. One of the things that's important is to make as few changes as possible in the child's environment. And why is that? Just in general. Why do we want to make as few as changes as possible?
It's already a hectic time. So anything to add to it.
That's exactly it. With the loss, again, of that parent, there is already overwhelming, dramatic change that's going to be very, very stressful. You want to try to keep everything else as consistent and as same as you possibly can. The last thing a child needs at this point is more and more changes. You know, so you don't want to immediately, you know, the next week move out of the house, change rooms, you know, those kinds of things. Even though you may be thinking that it's positive, it can simply add much more change, creating more transition at a time, as you said, is already so chaotic and so difficult to adjust to. Hold things as consistent as possible until we work through the early phases of the grieving. This is one I think that adults have the hardest time with young children. And I think this is true in general for people who are dealing with and moving through the grieving process, is to encourage the child to talk about the person who has died. You know, and why do we have a tendency or a hesitancy to allow people or to encourage people to talk? What are some reasons? And this is true not just with children, but I think it's just true with adults in general. Yeah, I think part of it is that which is partly true. You know, if I encourage you, create an environment that allows you to talk about it, it very well will create sadness. You know, and it may be kind of painful and hurtful at that moment. And you may break down and cry. And I think part of it a lot of times is we're uncomfortable with responding to those emotions. But I think what it's hard to understand sometimes is it is the process of allowing those emotions to come out with someone who's there and is caring and supportive and sensitive and nurturing. It is part of the healing process, as difficult as it is. And this is true for children as well, to be able to talk about, you know, and it's hard for children. Young children have a hard time putting into words what they're feeling. You know, and part of to help them move through that grieving process is to help enable them to know how to talk about it. And it may be nothing more than having them talk about the things that they most remember and what they might be missing, but to begin to start to work through some of those emotions. Otherwise, what will happen with young children, as it does with adults, is what will they do with those emotions? They'll bottle them up, they'll repress them, and then they'll begin, particularly with young children, will start to come out in other forms and other behaviors, of which then you'll end up dealing with those behaviors, and you'll get focused on those behaviors away from what's probably contributing to those behaviors. So again, just some helpful kinds of things to keep in mind in terms of helping children deal. Adult responses to death. Again, what we want to kind of do is to take a look at, as adults, the two significant losses, and again, there are many. I've focused really on two here. As I shared earlier, I've lost a sibling. You know, and that is an experience that we tend to have. But the two that tend to probably be most profound over the course of our lives is the loss of a parent and then the loss of a spouse. And those are the two I'm going to kind of focus on. We could say more about the others. This one probably maybe, and again, keep in mind, I think there are a lot of individual differences, based on the nature of the relationship between the child. And here we're thinking more of an adult child now, and the loss, of a parent, be that young adult, middle adulthood, whenever that might occur. Generally speaking, both men and women experience the loss of a mother as profound. And again, this probably seems overly logical, common sense. Why would that be? Yeah, traditionally in our society, and again, it's shifting and it's changing, mothers tend to be the ones who provide most of the care, who tend to be more invested in the child's life over the course of their lives. It tends to be the stronger relationship. Now, in my situation, I would probably honestly have to say that I had a very close relationship with my dad. I had 3 younger sisters, and my mom had a really close, which is not uncommon at all, really close connect, and still does, relationship with daughters. And I think naturally, because my dad and I were so much alike, I tended to identify and relate more closely with him as my sisters were kind of relating with my mother. And so I would probably be the exception to the rule in the sense that the loss of my father would be a more profound loss. And again, not to say that losing my mother wouldn't be, but there was a different relationship there. But typically we tend to find that for both men and women, the loss of a mother is really difficult. And again, because of that investment, often that really, really close relationship. This one may seem surprising, maybe not. Women tend to be more emotionally affected by the death of their fathers than are men. Now, what's the key words in there? Because I think this is partially misleading, but it may be related to certain words in this statement. Emotionally affected. It may not be that they're necessarily more overall affected, but one of the things we know is that clearly men and women tend to respond to loss, particularly of a parent, as well as of a spouse, very differently. What do women generally tend to do differently than men, do you think? One of them is again, clearly the expression of feelings. And then again, we're talking broad generalizations here. What else? Tend to connect more emotionally with people, particularly those that are still around, and will often seek out not only emotional but physical support. What do men have somewhat of a tendency to do? And again, very broad generalization. Keep it inside. What else might we have a tendency to do? Try to be the strong one. So at best we may offer support to others. We may be less inclined to accept emotional and particularly the physical support, because what men tend to do when they become really stressed is we have somewhat of a tendency to kind of close up inside, and in many cases, if we're not forced to really withdraw from other social interactions. As we withdraw from social interactions, what do we tend to do, though? And if you think about maybe the men we shift that energy, but we shift it more away from other relationships and to their work or hobbies or other activities. And what we'll really do is pour ourselves into that. And it's kind of like it's the place where we get lost. Some people will do that in other relationships. We'll tend to do that in other activities. And it's part of the way that we kind of work through that. It's almost like it becomes a distraction, a way of not directly or, dealing with, again, that grieving kind of process. Like we've already said, women are much more inclined to connect with other support kinds of systems, talk about it, talk about the person, talk about situations, and men will tend to kind of hold that inside. I think both grieve and grieve very strongly, but often will do that very, very differently. And again, a lot of that is just, I think, socialization over the years. So I think what's key here is the more emotionally affected, not maybe necessarily affected, by the loss. And it's hard to know because men tend not to express their feelings about the loss in the same way that women do. So I think we may not be capturing a lot of times what's really going on. When we look at the loss of a spouse, again, for a lot of the same reasons we've already said, women, generally speaking, tend to adjust better than men to the death of a spouse. And again, somewhat differently but still related, why might that be? What's going to be the differences? One of the things that we find for men, again, depending upon their age, is not uncommon for them to actually start dating and move into other relationships pretty quickly. Some of that, I think, is related to maybe not doing quite a good job of adjusting or dealing with that loss. What are some differences there in terms of, can you think of in terms of the loss of the spouse? Anyone?
Men probably don't have as many people to turn to. They probably just have that one, their wife, that was their name.
Exactly. Or if they do have someone to turn to, they're going to be probably less inclined to do that. Where women, I think, are more inclined to seek out other family members for that support. And it could be siblings or whoever it might be, or friends. Men tend not to do that. And what I have experienced, particularly with older adults, is that their main support network and system was their spouse. Share this story really quickly, but I'll never forget it. I was working in a situation where I worked with older adults and did some, it wasn't my primary role, but I did some hospital visitation at different times. And I remember this particular couple. They were both elderly, obviously married. And I remember one time they both were in the hospital at the same time, which was a little bit strange in terms of visiting both of them and both wanting to know how the other was doing. And I remember at this point, the wife was in the hospital, and he was not at this particular point when I was visiting, and she was released. And they had gone home. They lived in several floors up in a downtown apartment complex in a fairly large city, and they were on this particular day. She passed away sitting in her chair at the house. Really, and I mean, basically the doctor said she's doing fine, she's okay to go home, and then the next day she passes away, sitting in that chair. I went to the funeral, and then a short time after that, he basically had closed himself off. And the pastor of this particular church, he wouldn't let him in. I don't know why or any of the circumstances by it, and so I said, I'll go by and try. I don't know. So I went and rang and told him who I was, and he let me in. He let me up. And so I went up, and I'll never forget, in this particular house, there were two of those reclining chairs and a little end table in between the two chairs. And then there was the TV right in front of those two chairs and a couch that ran along the side of the living room here. And so I walked in the room, and he very quickly said, now, sit down over there and be quiet. So I sat down, and I was quiet. And on the set was a soap opera. And so I sat there with him. He never said anything. I never said anything else throughout the remainder of the soap opera. And then he got up and turned the TV off. And then, again, long story short, he proceeded to wanting to tell me that was what they sat in the chairs. They watched TV a lot of their time. In that particular show, they watched together. So we had to wait till it was over. And then I was there probably a couple of hours, I think. And eventually he led me through the house, and we talked. And he talked about his past, and he talked about his fear of his own death. But what really became obvious to me, that his whole life evolved around her and their relationship together. And he literally, which is not uncommon, he literally felt lost, And I remember when I left, I began to talk to other family members, and I said, you need to be, and again, not as a professional, just my sense was, you need to get him out of that house. You need to get him involved, invested in some other things, And I'm not sure people took me very seriously, because I bet you it wasn't but a few months later that he passed away as well. Because I think so much of his life evolved around that relationship. And he did, whether it was there or not, he didn't tap into any support network in the ways that he needed to. And I think he couldn't find any reason to go on. And I think he gave up. Now, I don't know that for sure. It was what my sense was, So again, I think men and women often, and again, I joke about this a lot, and because it is the reality so often, is men often will joke about, obviously we're going to go before our wives because women tend to outlive us, and so we often don't think about being left, as the widow or widower, so to speak. And so there are differences, and I do think, and again, depend upon situation, circumstances, age, women probably for a lot of reasons adjust better. There are things that women, obviously that maybe the male had done that they have to adjust to. But I think, at least my experiences, is often very, very resourceful in terms of figuring those things out. Older adults tend to adjust better to widowhood than younger adults. We found this to be true when we talked about divorce. Real quickly, what are some reasons why that would be true in terms of the death of a spouse versus a divorce? Why would older adults likely adjust better than if it occurs during the younger years, particularly young adulthood? Part of it clearly has to do with emotional maturity, emotional independence. Excellent. What else? Particularly if it happens during late adulthood, it is an expected part of life. Now, it still may be premature to what you hoped for, but it's still more expected at that stage, clearly, than it would be during young adulthood. When you feel like your life is just, kind of starting off and really in its prime in a lot of ways. A couple of other reasons. Yeah, again, less responsible for certain things, and so in some ways it may not be. There may be different demands with that. Plus, hopefully, over the course of the years that you've developed, as we've already said, some different coping skills, and may have some different resources for dealing with, with that loss. So again, we find some differences there. Last thing we want to look at, which I think most of you are familiar with, I'm going to just put them up here together, are the stages of death. These are Kubler-Ross's stages. They're pretty classic. And again, here we're talking about the stages that an individual goes through in terms of dealing with their own. And these would be typical stages that we would go through if we found out today, that we had 3 months to live. One of the things I found in terms of my own experiences is that if people go through all of these stages, they sure don't experience and express them in the same ways. And I'm not necessarily convinced that all people necessarily go through all 5 stages, though I think probably the majority do to some extent. And some, I think, may skip a stage, may move through some of those stages a whole lot faster. First stage is denial. Again, and a lot of these were going to coincide very closely, again, with the grieving process. Because, and again, as we deal with our own inevitable death, we're going to grieve over that reality, in the loss of life. And not just the loss of our own personal life, but the loss of the daily connectedness with the people in our lives and the events in our lives and those things that have given our life meaning. So there is initially denial. This can't be happening. Not at this point in my life. And again, when it happens much, much later in life, much easier to accept some of that. But there is the denial. A lot of times what people will, once they've kind of worked through the denial, and as they begin to start to accept it, there's often anger. And again, a lot of things are going to determine the intensity of that anger. If I'm really young, I'm going to be a whole lot angrier. This is not fair, this is not right, I have my whole life ahead of me, how can that be taken away from me? Very different than if I'm 90 and felt like I've lived most of my life and it's been good. I never experienced in my dealing with my dad any of the anger. He seemed to know, whether he really did or not, he seemed to accept it day one. I mean literally day one. And again, I think that's part of how my dad lived life. You just accept what life gives you, and there wasn't a lot of these 3 stages. Now, it may have been happening in a way that we were unaware of, and internally, but externally you would not have seen that. But there is the denial, there is the anger. For many, there is the bargaining. And who do we bargain with? Whatever our image of some supreme being is, and this is where you'll get people who will say, if you'll change, this outcome for me, I will change my life, I'll give away all my money, I'll do whatever I can, just let this pass, kind of speak. I think then what begins to happen is as people get in touch with, as they kind of move through the anger, they realize in most cases the bargaining, and again, it has nothing to do with people having faith and belief, but at some point in time people begin to accept the reality or the inevitableness of that and then tend to move into a period of depression. I did see the depression that my dad experienced as his illness progressed. That was the only really emotion of these stages that I saw outwardly, And that was in the experience of all the things that he was now no longer to do that he enjoyed doing, not so much related to the reality of the death, but how the illness was making him more and more disabled. And that's where a lot of that depression came for. And then for some, there is eventually an acceptance. I think if my wife were here to tell you that her as a pastor dealing with people dealing with death, that what she has found that a lot of times as people come to terms with it, there tends to be something that happens where people ultimately begin to accept it and then tend to have somewhat of a peace about it. And I think she would say that it's not uncommon a lot of times for people, particularly who are in terminal situations, that often pass away very shortly after. However, they have kind of come to terms with that and accepted and found a peace about that part of their life. However, they do that internally. So again, people will move through these stages again at very different paces, different rates. I'm not sure that necessarily everyone will always go through, all of those stages. We have come over the course of the semester quite a journey, of really looking at the life stages. And as we've looked at human development over the life cycle, as we said pretty much on the very first day, it's about changes. My hope is that some of this information, beyond the fact that most of you took the course because you had to take it, it was a required course, for your programs, that there will be some information. Some of it you'll be able to somehow apply to your life somewhere down the road. Either in terms of stages that you have yet to live, having a different awareness, a different preparation for that. For those of you at some point in time may become parents in your lives, can apply that in terms of raising children and applying what you know about development during the early stages, that at some point in time the information will be useful beyond just the course that you took. As we said, kind of pretty much the first day, change is the reality. You and I, from this day on, are going to continue to change. The other thing I hope you remember is that growth is intentional. The ways in which we grow, the ways in which we change, those we have some control over. And so my hope for all of us is that as we change and we continue on our remaining journey of life, that we'll be very intentional, that we will change and grow in ways that enhance the quality of our life from this point on, and that life will be a good thing. And when we all come to that final stage of life, we can look back and say, I've lived a good life. I don't have regrets. I've done the things I've needed to do, and I've said the things I needed to say. And as we kind of left off with the song that started this final phase, live as if we were dying. Live life to its fullest every day.